Today we will explore one of the most fascinating and controversial questions in medieval military history. After all, were swords capable of piercing plate armor? Throughout this documentary, we will dive into the historical evidence, the manufacturing centers, the combat techniques, and the primary sources surrounding this centuries-old debate. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. On a 15th century battlefield, the mist slowly clears over a dew-drenched valley. The metallic sound of clashing armor echoes through the hills as hundreds of men advance against each other in a dance of survival. On one side, knights covered from head to toe in gleaming steel plates. On the other, soldiers wielding longswords whose blades taper at the tip like needles. In this setting, a question hangs in the air like the smell of iron and sweat. Would it be possible for those blades to penetrate those metal breastplates? This is the question that brought us here, and the answer, as we shall see, is not as simple as many would like it to be. To understand this debate, one must first step back in time and follow the evolution of the body protection that European warriors used. For centuries, mail, or chainmail, was the primary form of body defense in Europe. Composed of thousands of small, interlinked and riveted iron or steel rings, it offered good protection against cuts, though it was more vulnerable to thrusts and blunt impacts. Mail was flexible, followed the contours of the body, and for centuries was the trademark of medieval combatants. From the time of the barbarian migrations until the 13th century, Europe lived through what historians call the Age of Mail. Warriors wore long mail shirts called hauberks, accompanied by hoods, gloves, and even leggings made of the same material. It was an ingenious technology, but one that had clear limits in the face of advancing offensive weapons. The development of plate armor was a gradual process that spanned several centuries, closely linked to the political, social, and technological transformations of the late Middle Ages. The roots of this development date back to the 13th century, when the first plate elements began to be added over existing mail, protecting especially vulnerable areas such as the chest, forearms, and shins. An important step in this transition was the emergence of the brigandine, a type of intermediate armor between mail and plate. The brigandine consisted of small metal plates fixed to the inside of a fabric jacket, offering superior protection to pure mail while being more flexible and lighter than a full suit of plate armor. Another milestone in this evolution was the so-called coat of plates, popular between the late 13th and early 14th centuries, which was worn over the mail shirt and represented a practical solution for reinforcing torso protection. The true technological leap, however, came in the 14th century, especially in the context of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that lasted from 1337 to 1453 and pitted two of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, France and England, against each other. This period became known as the era of transitional armor, in which plates gradually replaced mail. Advances in metallurgy and the art of blacksmithing allowed for the production of armor that was increasingly lighter and at the same time more resistant. Changes in warfare, particularly the growing use of longbows and crossbows, demanded improved protection for combatants. Plate armor offered an effective response to these new threats. Blacksmiths developed innovative techniques to shape the plates so that they followed the contours of the body, ensuring maximum freedom of movement. During the 14th century, plate elements became larger and more complex, and fastening methods improved, resulting in greater mobility for the wearer. By the end of that century, many knights were equipped with a combination of mail and extensive plate elements, paving the way for the full plate armor of the 15th century. It is precisely in the 15th century that the art of plate armor reaches its zenith. During this period, blacksmiths created true masterpieces of metallurgy that were not only functional, but also aesthetically impressive. The full suit of plate armor, also called a harness, covered the knight literally from head to toe. Contrary to what popular culture suggests, a fully armed knight maintained surprising agility. He could run, jump, and mount a horse without assistance, as the weight of the armor, usually between 20 and 25 kilograms, 44 to 55 pounds, was distributed evenly across the entire body. The image of a knight being hoisted into the saddle by a crane is a Hollywood fiction that finds no historical support. During the 15th and early 16th centuries, soldiers in plate armor formed the core of all European armies. Large contingents of men-at-arms, numbering thousands or even more than 10,000 combatants, fought on foot wearing full armor, side by side with archers and crossbowmen. This was common in the wars of Western Europe, especially during the 100 Years' War, the Wars of the Roses and the Italian Wars. But here it is necessary to pause and shed light on a fundamental aspect that is often ignored in popular discussions: the enormous variation that existed among the armor produced in medieval Europe. It is easy to imagine that all knights wore identical armor, as if there were a standardized uniform distributed by some central authority. Nothing could be further from the truth. Medieval armor varied enormously in terms of quality, material, thickness, area of coverage, and manufacturing technique. This variation depended on numerous factors: the wealth of the person commissioning it, the skill of the person forging it, the materials available in the region, and the era in which it was produced. According to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, one of the largest and most respected collections of arms and armor in the world, the most important regions for armor production in Renaissance Europe were northern Italy and southern Germany, with workshops from both regions exporting their products across the continent. Probably the most dynamic center of armor manufacturing during the 15th century was the Italian city of Milan, home to the oldest comparatively well-documented family of armorers, the Missaglias. This prominent family produced at least 4 known armorers: Thomas, recorded from 1430 and deceased in 1452, Anthony, recorded from 1441 and deceased in 1496, John Angel, recorded between 1496 and 1529, and Damien, recorded in 1514. Their workshops appear to have exported armor throughout Europe. The secret of Milan's success lay partly in its geographical location. The Alps provided abundant iron ore, as well as the trees necessary to produce the charcoal used in smelting. Canals brought materials to the city and powered the hammer mills that transformed ore into steel. Unlike their peers in southern Germany, Italian masters were not restricted by guild regulations, and Milanese workshops collaborated openly with one another, pooling their resources for large orders. In the third quarter of the 15th century, there were more than 70 master armorers in the city, concentrated around the Cathedral Square, Piazza del Duomo, and the Merchants' Square, Piazza dei Mercanti. In the 16th century, Milan still housed the workshop of the descendant of the Missaglias, Philip Negroli, considered perhaps the most skilled and famous armorer of all time. The Negrolis produced sumptuously decorated armor for the Holy Roman Emperor, the Dukes of Urbino, and the French and Spanish royal courts. On the other side of the Alps, in the German-speaking world, armor production centered on several hubs: the imperial cities of Augsburg, Basel, Landshut, and Nuremberg, as well as the court workshop of the Holy Roman Emperors in Innsbruck. Families such as the Helmschmieds of Augsburg and the Seusenhofers of Innsbruck produced extraordinary pieces for emperors and princes, creating traditions of excellence that lasted for generations. Nuremberg was renowned for its mail armor, while Cologne stood out for the manufacture of fine swords since at least the 12th century. Passau and Solingen were synonymous with sword blades of exceptional quality. 2 distinct styles of armor emerged in Western Europe during the 15th century: the Italian, characterized by smoothness and roundness in the modeling of the pieces, and the German, more angular and pointed, often referred to as Gothic. However, as both countries exported armor and armorers, elements of both styles soon blended throughout Europe. But if Milan, Augsburg, and Nuremberg represented the pinnacle of armor manufacturing, it is crucial to remember that a large part of Europe depended on the importation of these pieces. England, France, and the Low Countries imported most of their armor from Italy and Germany. The knowledge we have about the production of other regions remains fragmentary. In Portugal, there is practically no evidence of armor that has survived from the 14th and 15th centuries. In Scotland, although there are records of production, no piece has been found to this day. This gap in physical evidence is a point that deserves deep reflection. When we try to understand how armor behaved in combat, we are dealing with an incomplete historical record. The few specimens that have survived to our day represent only a tiny fraction of what was produced over centuries, and they tend to be high-quality pieces, preserved precisely because of their value. The simplest and cheapest armor, used by common soldiers, mercenaries, and members of the lower nobility, rarely survive the test of time. This leads us to a fundamental point. When someone categorically states that swords could not pierce plate armor, one must ask, which armor are we talking about? Because the truth is that there was an enormous disparity in quality among the available armor. To illustrate this disparity, one only needs to think of the difference between a luxury automobile equipped with all available safety technology and a budget vehicle with minimal protection. Both are cars, both transport their occupants, but the difference in protection between them is abysmal. Similarly, in the Middle Ages, those with many resources could commission the best armor of their time, made by the most skilled armorers in Milan or Augsburg, with superior quality steel, adequate thickness, and a perfect fit to the body. On the other hand, those with fewer economic resources bought simpler, less resistant, and lower quality armor. Mercenaries, infantrymen, and members of the lower nobility also had access to armor, but from a considerably lower price and quality range. Researcher John Clements, one of the leading specialists in contemporary medieval military history and founder of the Association for Renaissance Martial Arts, addressed this issue in his article on swords against armor. According to him, there was no standardization in metal quality, size, covered area, and thickness of medieval armor. In other words, on the battlefield, it would be possible to find extraordinarily resistant armor side by side with others that were significantly more fragile. This variation is essential to understanding the debate at hand, and it was not just the armor that varied. The technique and metallurgical knowledge of the armorers themselves differed enormously from region to region and from workshop to workshop. As researcher Jill Jason observes in her doctoral thesis, it is difficult to fully comprehend the skill and resources that were employed in the production of these magnificent pieces. The true secret of the master armorer lay in the details and individual experience, especially in the heat treatment process of the metal. Metallurgical studies conducted on surviving pieces revealed that the construction of blades and armor did not follow a simple and uniform pattern, but involved sophisticated techniques of combining different carbon contents to achieve the ideal balance between hardness and flexibility. This scenario of variation becomes even more complex when we consider the temporal factor. Plate armor was in use for about 200 years, from the late 14th century to the 16th century. Throughout this period, metallurgical technology underwent considerable transformations. Armor from the early 14th century was drastically different from that produced at the height of the 15th century, which in turn differed from 16th century pieces. Trying to generalize about the behavior of armor throughout this entire period would be like trying to generalize about the performance of automobiles throughout the entire 20th century. That is why any categorical statement about the ability or inability of swords to penetrate armor must necessarily specify the period, location, and context in question. A prime example of this careful approach was offered by the channel Todd's Workshop, which conducted a test involving great and respected specialists on the use of longbows against armor in the context of the 100 Years' War. In this study, the team chose a specific date and a specific battle, Agincourt, precisely because the available evidence was more abundant. Researcher Tobias Capwell explained that Agincourt was a good battle to focus on, not just for its fame, but also because there was a lot of evidence about it, including armor found exactly from the period of the battle. Even so, with all this evidence at hand, the master Fletcher who conducted the test was cautious in his conclusions, noting that there was much variation in materials and that an enormous amount of information still needed to be learned about the period. Great specialists were not dogmatic and admitted that there was still much to learn. This epistemological humility should serve as an example for all who venture into this discussion. It is precisely this caution that makes blind trust in modern tests problematic. As Clements himself observed in his article, modern experiments done under approximate circumstances, with historically accurate weapons and using correct techniques on reproduction pieces, still need to convincingly duplicate what is represented in historical instances of blade penetration. In other words, the tests we see on television programs or on the internet however spectacular they may be, cannot accurately replicate all the variables involved in real 15th century combat. Modern reproductions of armor, however careful they may be, cannot exactly reproduce the techniques, materials, and manufacturing processes of every medieval workshop. Likewise, those performing the tests rarely possess the martial training and real combat experience that medieval warriors accumulated over a lifetime. But if modern tests are insufficient to resolve the issue, where should we turn for answers? This is where the primary sources of the time come in: the chronicles, the paintings and illuminations, and the fencing manuals. And it is at this point in our investigation that the scenario begins to become truly interesting. Before examining these sources, however, we need to understand the other half of the equation: the swords. Just as with armor, there was no single standard of quality or shape for medieval swords. Every kingdom, every county, every borough had its own way and skill for manufacturing blades. There were exceptional swords, forged by the most skilled bladesmiths, and others of considerably lower quality. The advantage of the sword against armor and vice versa on the battlefield always depended on a central factor: the quality of both. However, in the case of swords, they developed a special advantage that deserves detailed attention: the evolution of their shape. Between the 14th and 15th centuries, European swords underwent a true morphological revolution. This transformation was a direct response to the advancement of plate armor. While earlier swords were designed primarily to cut, with wide and relatively uniform blades, the new swords came to be conceived for piercing. Blades could now be made with triangular or diamond-shaped cross-sections, transforming long swords into true piercing instruments. This geometry made the blade extremely rigid and resistant to bending, essential characteristics for a weapon whose primary function was to penetrate metal defenses. Along the center of the blade, many of these swords featured a raised rib called a riser or central ridge, which concentrated the force of the blow along the central axis of the blade instead of dispersing it across the entire surface. This feature played a crucial role in increasing the rigidity of the blade tip, reducing the probability of bending during a critical thrust without compromising the overall durability and strength of the weapon. This rigidity proved essential as thrusting became the primary method of sword attack against armor. The thickness and rounded shape of armor plates presented considerable resistance to cutting blows, making piercing the most promising strategy. The longsword, with its extended hilt that allowed for use with one or two hands, offered remarkable versatility on the battlefield. With its longer blade, it could be used effectively against lightly armed opponents, while the two-handed grip option provided additional power and control for attacks against heavily armed adversaries. But perhaps the most revealing innovation of this era was the emergence of specialized swords designed exclusively to pierce armor. The estoc, also known as a tuck in English or a Panzerstecher in German, which literally means armor piercer, represents the most extreme example of this specialization. The estoc emerged in 14th century France during the 100 Years' War as a direct response to the widespread adoption of plate armor. Characterized by a long, narrow, and rigidly sharpened blade at the tip, usually with a triangular cross-section, the estoc had no cutting edge. Its only function was to pierce. Specimens found in Poland measured more than 160 centimeters, 63 inches in total length, with blades of 130 centimeters, 51 inches, though others featured more manageable dimensions of 115 centimeters, 45 inches, with blades of 90 centimeters, 35 inches. These swords weighed on average about 2 kilograms, 4.4 pounds, with no specimen exceeding 2 kilograms and 700 grams, 6 pounds. The geometry of the blade could vary between triangular, square, rhomboid, or flat hexagonal, but all shared the same fundamental characteristic: exceptional rigidity, designed to concentrate all the force of the blow into a single point of impact. Museums such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Art Institute of Chicago preserve notable examples of estocs in their collections. The museum descriptions are revealing. They are rigid blades designed to pierce mail or penetrate the joints of plate armor. One specimen from the Art Institute of Chicago features a peculiar crutch-shaped pommel, possibly designed to help support the rear end of the hilt while the user pressed the tip of the blade through the armor of an immobilized opponent. The very existence of these weapons, preserved in some of the most respected museums in the world, constitutes material evidence that armor piercing was not just a theoretical possibility, but a real practical concern that motivated the development of specialized weapons. The estoc reached its peak usage in the 15th and 16th centuries, becoming a standard weapon among mercenary forces such as the Italian condottieri and the German Landsknechts. Knights often kept the estoc attached to the front of the saddle as an auxiliary weapon, complementing the arming sword, warhammer, or mace. But the estoc was not the only resource available to combatants facing armed opponents. Medieval fencing manuals document a series of techniques developed specifically to deal with adversaries in plate armor. Among them, the most emblematic was the technique known as half-swording in German Halbschwert. This technique consisted of holding the long sword with one hand on the hilt and the other holding the blade directly, approximately in the middle, transforming the weapon into a kind of short spear, capable of precise and powerful blows directed at the vulnerabilities of the armor. The technique may seem counterintuitive at first glance. However, as practitioners of historical European martial arts explain, holding the blade with the hand, especially when equipped with leather or mail gloves, did not pose a significant risk of cutting. Medieval longswords were not razors in the modern sense. Their effectiveness depended on a combination of a reasonably sharp edge and kinetic energy. Half-swording was used both to gain an advantage in close-quarters wrestling, functioning as a lever in immobilization and takedown techniques, and to deliver more precise and powerful thrusts. Both these functions were crucial in combat against plate armor, as cutting or slashing blows were virtually useless against iron or steel plates. Most medieval fencing treatises depict armored combat as consisting primarily of half-sword fighting. The best options against an armed man were strong thrusts directed at less protected areas, such as the armpits, groin, helmet visor, or throat, or else the same techniques applied against an adversary who had already been knocked to the ground. And here we come to one of the most precious sources for our investigation, the medieval fencing manuals, the so-called Fechtbücher in German. These manuscripts, produced between the 14th and 16th centuries, constitute detailed records of the combat techniques of the time, often accompanied by illustrations, showing movements and postures with remarkable precision. Among the most important of these manuals for our question is the Codex Wallenstein, a compendium of 15th-century manuscripts currently preserved in the Augsburg University Library. It is a compilation of 3 distinct manuscripts, with the oldest part dating from the 1420s, focused on armed combat techniques. This section illustrates fights in full plate armor, including judicial duels and tournament scenarios. Central to this part are longsword techniques in armor, in which combatants employ the half-sword grip and precise thrusts to explore vulnerabilities in plate harnesses. The illustrations show knights attacking with the sword point at the joints and weak points of the opponent's armor, while others apply techniques such as the Mordau, the death stroke, in which the sword is held inverted with both hands on the blade, to strike the opponent with the pommel or the crossguard, using the sword essentially as a mace. Other fencing manuals corroborate these techniques. The teachings attributed to the master John Lichtenauer, considered the founder of the German tradition of fencing, emphasize the importance of the thrust against armed opponents. The manual by Hans Talhofer, dated approximately 1459, represents German Gothic armor of the period and demonstrates armed combat techniques. And the master Joachim Meyer, through his doctrine published in the mid-16th century, explicitly taught that against armor, it was necessary to use specialized piercing swords, with blows directed at the eyes of the opponent's helmet and the weak points of the armor, such as the abdominal region. All these manuals converge on a central point: the existence of systematic and documented techniques for attacking plate armor with swords constitutes powerful evidence that such an attack was not just theoretically possible, but a recognized and trained practice. Medieval illuminations and paintings offer another equally valuable layer of evidence. For a long time, some voices dismissed these visual representations as exaggerated or fanciful. However, this position finds no support among serious scholars of medieval art and history. Medieval arts are, in a sense, the only photographs we possess of that era. Historian Matthew Strickland, cited in works on wars and crusades in the Middle Ages, analyzed the so-called Crusader Bible, an illuminated manuscript from the 13th century with rich images and details about the period. According to him, the quality and details of its execution suggest first-hand knowledge by the artist of the construction of weapons and armor, and by extension, their possible performance in battle. Medieval art specialist Daniel Wise also commented on the extraordinary accuracy with which artists represented battle scenes using their own context. Medieval artists were not amateur illustrators who invented imaginary scenes. They were students and experts in representing the battles and combats of their own period. This does not mean that every detail of every medieval painting should be taken literally. There are clearly exaggerated representations, such as paintings showing warriors being cut in half, armor and all. These images are evidently artistic stylizations that should not be interpreted as photographic records. However, one must distinguish between the clearly fanciful and the plausible. It was one thing to cut a person in half with armor and all, something no known sword would be capable of doing. It was a completely different thing to partially cut a helmet or pierce the more fragile points of armor with a precise thrust. The numerous representations of these latter scenarios, present in multiple manuscripts from different regions and periods, suggest that such events were sufficiently well known to be portrayed regularly. In the academic article titled Sword Against Armor, based on analyses of the miniatures from Froissart's Chronicles painted by Loisette Liédet, the researcher examined in detail how swords were represented interacting with armor in these 15th century works. Liédet's miniatures on Froissart's Chronicles are particularly valuable because they are contemporary to the period they portray, and because they present a level of technical detail that denotes real familiarity with the weapons and armor of the time. The article analyzes morphological details of the blades represented, including central ribs and tip shapes optimized for piercing, and compares them with real specimens that have survived in museum collections. The agreement between artistic representations and material evidence reinforces the reliability of these visual sources. The Chronicles of John Froissart, written during the 1390s and covering the period from 1327 to 1400, are one of the most important primary sources for the study of medieval warfare. Froissart was a meticulous chronicler who traveled extensively through Europe and personally interviewed participants in the events he reported. His descriptions of battles, tournaments, and combats are remarkably detailed and include precious information about weapons and armor. Other chroniclers of the time, such as Philip de Comines, provide equally detailed descriptions of the armor used in historical battles and important events. These descriptions are often surprisingly accurate and offer us valuable information about the development of armor technology over time. Revealingly, these chronicles also address practical aspects of armor, reporting the difficulties of wearing heavy armor and the heat and thirst that knights had to endure inside their metal protections. In one of these chronicles, a knight has the armor of his thigh pierced by the thrust of a sword during a duel. Any scholar of medieval history recognizes the importance of Froissart's Chronicles for understanding how battles of the time worked, especially emblematic conflicts such as the Battle of Crécy in 1346, the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, and the celebrated Battle of Agincourt in 1415. And not only in the French and English orbits, medieval chronicles are also fundamental for understanding crucial battles of the Iberian Peninsula, such as the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385, considered the most important confrontation in the history of Portugal, where Portuguese forces commanded by King John I decisively defeated the Castilian army. A particularly revealing painting, dated 1463 and preserved in the National Archive of the Vienna Library, shows a longsword piercing the abdominal region of a suit of plate armor. In the same image, the knight delivering the blow is in a perfect German fencing posture known as Ochs, or Ox, one of the fundamental positions taught in the fencing manuals of the Lichtenauer tradition. The correspondence between the posture represented in the painting and the teachings documented in the fencing manuals lends additional credibility to this image. It is not an artistic fantasy, but a technical representation that coincides precisely with what we know about the martial practices of the time. Other paintings of the period show similar scenarios: plate helmets being partially cut by sword blows, knights applying half-sword techniques against the joints of their opponent's armor. These images do not exist in isolation. They form a consistent body of visual evidence that, when analyzed together with the fencing manuals and written chronicles, paints a coherent picture. The argument often raised that medieval paintings are exaggerated and unreliable deserves to be examined with care. It is true that medieval artists did not operate with the same criteria of photographic realism as modern artists. Symbolic, religious, and decorative elements often mixed with factual representations. However, when it comes specifically to weapons and armor, medieval artists demonstrated remarkable technical knowledge. The Maciejowski Bible, an illuminated manuscript from the 13th century, is an extraordinary example of this precision. Its representations of combat show specific details of weapon and armor construction that faithfully correspond to the archaeological specimens that have survived. The artists who produced these works had direct access to the objects they portrayed, and were often commissioned by patrons who demanded accuracy in such representations. It is also important to note that not all plate armor was equally thick in all its parts. Armor was designed with variable thicknesses. Areas most exposed to direct blows, such as the breastplate and the helmet, were generally thicker, while areas that needed to allow for greater mobility, such as the joints of the arms and legs, were necessarily thinner. These thinner areas, known as weak points, were preferred targets for trained combatants. Fencing manuals devoted considerable attention to teaching how to identify and attack these vulnerable points. The joints of the elbow, the knee, the armpit region, the groin, the neck, and the slot of the helmet visor were the most frequently mentioned targets. Now, having traveled this path of evidence and reflections, we can finally address the central question with due nuance. Was it possible for swords to pierce plate armor? The answer, as historical data suggests, is complex and multifaceted. On one hand, it is undeniable that good quality plate armor offered exceptional protection. Armor well forged by a master armorer from Milan or Augsburg, made with superior quality steel and adequate thickness, could deflect the vast majority of sword blows. The rounded and angular shapes of the plates were specifically designed to deflect blades and points, transforming potentially lethal blows into harmless glides across the metal surface. Techniques such as fluting in German Gothic armor were not just decorative. They structurally reinforced the plate against bending under impact. Wearing a high-quality suit of plate armor gave its wearer a formidable advantage on the battlefield, making him almost invulnerable to many types of attack. The very existence of weapons such as the mace, the warhammer, and the poleaxe proves the effectiveness of armor. If swords could simply pierce armor without difficulty, there would be no reason for the development of these blunt weapons, designed specifically to cause damage through the plate by means of impact and deformation. The fact that knights carried diverse arsenals, including swords, maces, hammers, and daggers, indicates that each weapon had its specific role, and that none of them was universally effective against all forms of protection. On the other hand, however, the evidence equally indicates that under certain conditions, swords could indeed penetrate plate armor. These conditions included a combination of factors: the quality of the sword, the type and shape of the blade, the technique employed, the exact location of the thrust, the strength and skill of the swordsman, and, crucially, the quality, thickness, and state of preservation of the opponent's armor. When a sword of excellent quality, with a sharp point and rigid blade, was directed by a skilled swordsman against a vulnerable point of lower quality armor, penetration was not only possible, but documented in multiple primary sources of the time. Medieval paintings show swords penetrating armor. Fencing manuals taught specific techniques for this purpose. Chronicles report cases of armor pierced by thrusts, and the very evolution of swords, from cutting weapons to thrusting weapons with increasingly specialized geometries, only makes sense if we consider that this evolution responded to a real and practical need to penetrate plate defenses. An arms race only exists when both sides are effectively competing. If armor were absolutely impenetrable by swords, there would be no reason for bladesmiths to invest centuries of innovation in the development of specialized piercing blades. However, it is equally important to recognize that the frequency with which this occurred on the battlefield is simply impossible to determine with precision. We do not possess medieval casualty statistics that discriminate causes of death with the level of detail we would like. Chronicled accounts, however valuable they may be, represent only a fraction of real events and often focus on the most dramatic or notable episodes. Using logic and common sense, we can infer that good quality plate armor protected its wearers very well in most situations, and that piercing by a sword represented a real possibility, but probably not the norm. This nuanced conclusion is more intellectually honest than the extreme positions that dominate popular debate. Categorically stating that swords could never pierce plate armor is as inaccurate as stating that they did so with ease. Historical reality, as almost always, lies on a complex spectrum of possibilities, determined by a multiplicity of variables that made every encounter on the battlefield a unique equation. The history of swords against armor is, in the end, a story of innovation and adaptation. When armor became more resistant, swords evolved to find new ways to overcome it. When swords became more piercing, armor became thicker and more rounded to deflect thrusts. This incessant competition between offense and defense drove centuries of technological advancement in European metallurgy and produced some of the most sophisticated achievements of pre-industrial engineering. And it is remarkable that throughout all this evolution, the sword remained the most versatile weapon of its time. It could cut, pierce, serve as a lever in immobilization techniques, and even be used inverted as a hammer. Its adaptability was such that it survived even the decline of plate armor, transforming into the rapiers and fencing swords of the Renaissance and remaining a military weapon until centuries after the widespread introduction of firearms. No other bladed weapon demonstrated such a capacity for reinvention throughout history. As we look back at those 15th century battlefields where knights in gleaming armor faced each other with swords, whose geometry was the result of centuries of refinement, we must resist the temptation of simple answers. Medieval history does not lend itself to absolute statements. It invites us instead to embrace complexity, to recognize the vastness of what we do not know, and to respect the evidence that the men and women of that time bequeathed to us through their writings, their paintings, and their artifacts. The wide variety of armor, the skill of those who made it, the quality of the steel used, the thickness of the plates, the technologies, and the construction sites, all these factors greatly affected every suit of armor produced. There was no plate armor in the singular. There were numerous suits of plate armor, of different qualities and degrees of resistance. On the other side, the quality of the sword, the shape of the blade, the technique of the swordsman, and the exact location of the thrust determined the outcome of every encounter. The evidence from medieval paintings, the techniques documented in fencing manuals, the reports from the chronicles of the time. All these sources converge to indicate that the penetration of plate armor by swords was a documented reality of the medieval period. These accounts cannot be simply dismissed. At the same time, logic tells us that plate armor offered exceptional protection and could deflect many sword blows, for after all, that was precisely its purpose. The technique of the Mordau warhammers and blunt weapons in general confirm that armor was efficient. But this efficiency varied with quality, and quality varied enormously. Therefore, in the same 15th century battle, it was perfectly possible to witness swords-piercing armor in some parts of the field of combat, while in others, those same blows were deflected without causing damage. The determining variable was not the sword or the armor in abstract terms, but the specific interaction between that particular sword and that particular suit of armor, at that specific moment and in those specific circumstances. This is the lesson history offers us. Reality is almost always more complex and more fascinating than the simplifications we try to impose upon it. The history of swords against plate armor is not a story of absolute victory for one side or the other. It is a story of competition, of adaptation, of human ingenuity in the face of the challenges of war. And it is precisely this complexity that makes the study of the medieval past such a rich and rewarding intellectual adventure. Medieval battlefields fell silent long ago. Swords are now in museum display cases, and armor gleams under carefully controlled lights in exhibition halls. But the questions they ask us remain alive. Every piece of steel forged centuries ago carries with it a story of skill, of necessity, and of ingenuity. It is up to us, scholars and enthusiasts of the present, to listen to these stories with the attention and respect they deserve, without simplifications and without dogmatism. If this investigation has awakened in you the same curiosity that moved us to carry it out, then we ask you to join us on this journey through the past. Subscribe to the channel to follow more narratives like this one, leave your comment with your reflections, questions, or discoveries, and share this content with those who are also fascinated by medieval history. Because every question we ask the past is a step toward a deeper understanding of who we are and where we came from. And that is a journey worth taking together.